Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Mariana Budjeryn, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. And I wanted to start by asking you, in your book, Inheriting the Bomb, your book sheds light on Ukraine's nuclear disarmament post-USSR. And at the outset of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Budapest Memorandum was often cited and referred to throughout, in international media. Could you elaborate to our viewers the critical factors that influenced Ukraine's top decision makers back then to relinquish the country's nuclear arsenal?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. So Ukraine's nuclear decision-making was a complicated process, right? It was not an easy and straightforward thing. Ukraine really deliberated its options and its choices at the time. And there were factors that weighed in favor of retaining some kind of nuclear option, maybe a nuclear latency, a nuclear hedge, as we call it in the field, and also very powerful factors that weighed in favor of disarmament. So on the one side of the ledger were, of course, security concerns, because immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, even though there were hopes that Russia would emerge from that process as a sort of fellow democracy, right, under the democratic leadership of Boris Yeltsin, a fellow aspiring democracy that would treat Ukraine as as a sovereign state. This was proving to be not quite the case, and issues over the status of Crimea, over the division of the Black Sea Fleet Station in Crimea, but also other issues really came to the fore very early on. We forget that this is not something that just started 3 or even 10 years ago in 2014. Russia has consistently refused to accept this idea of independent Ukraine. But on the other hand, there were factors like the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster of 1986 that left a profound impact on Ukrainian society. And all things nuclear were viewed with suspicion, right? Including the weapons that were left. There's really large amount of nuclear weapons left on Ukrainian territory by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so Ukraine started its path towards its independent statehood with the declaration of sovereignty in July 1990, with a unilateral nuclear renunciation. Essentially, it was part of this very important state-building document, nation-building document, where Ukrainian parliament declared that in the future, Ukraine wants to be a nuclear-free state. And Chernobyl was a big factor in that. And also desire to distance Ukraine from Moscow in these military strategic terms. Now, later on, this issue became more nuanced. Ukraine staked a claim that this was Ukraine's rightful property, rightful ownership to these nuclear armaments as a successor state of the Soviet Union. And on the basis of this claim, Ukraine was able to negotiate a nuclear deal. And the Budapest Memorandum, which you mentioned, was a very important part, but only a part of that deal that pledged security assurances, security commitments to Ukraine by nuclear states, including Russia, which of course Russia would go on to violate.
Right. We know that, Ukraine's energy supplies back in the 1990s came from Russia, gas, oil, and fuel for nuclear power plants, providing half of Ukraine's energy mix back then. So I suppose there was enormous leverage on Russia's side and perhaps very little leverage on Ukraine's side, right?
Indeed. So Ukraine was dependent on energy supplies by Russia. Ukraine was also hopeful to get international financial assistance from the West, from international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, the funds from which, structural economic funds from which Ukraine badly needed to stabilize its economy. Ukraine was in the throes of a very deep economic crisis following the Soviet collapse, this transitional crisis. And so in those financial institutions, of course, it was the United States that played an outsized role. So there was Ukraine face to face with two nuclear weapon states that had quite a bit of leverage over its future, right? So Ukraine was still able to hold its own, was still able to negotiate a deal under those circumstances. And that should be acknowledged as actually a success of Ukrainian diplomacy. But it is also untrue to state that Ukraine had no options at the time. It was certainly a very difficult position that Ukraine was in, but Ukraine still had an enormous infrastructure. It inherited a huge chunk of not just the weapons that were left there, but also the military industrial complex that served to deliver this nuclear deterrent. So Ukraine did have some options at the time.
I came across a number of authors, mostly Western authors, who claimed that these nuclear bombs that Ukraine possessed were almost useless without the codes that were apparently kept in Moscow. Was this the case at all?
Oh, I mean, certainly that's part of the story. There were ways that the Central Command, the tools that it had to prevent unauthorized use, right? So the tactical nuclear weapons had so-called permissive action links, so a set of code that would have to activate that. The strategic nuclear component had a more sophisticated and highly centralized system of command and control, where we know these nuclear briefcases that would send permissive commands and all of that. Of course, that was all left in Moscow, the command and control. I think one thing that we need to keep in mind, that all of these systems are created by humans, not by aliens or by God that given on tablets, by Moses. And again, Ukrainian engineers were part and parcel of designing these command and control systems. So you could certainly think of ways, and even Western experts acknowledge that if there were a will, within a certain amount of time, 18 to 24 months, Ukrainians could have established operational control over the chunk of that nuclear armaments. I think the bigger question is, how would Ukraine need to invest in the missing links of a nuclear weapons program going forward, so that it could maintain it and regenerate it and, properly care for its nuclear deterrent long term, right? So it's not just a matter of grabbing what's on the Ukrainian territory, but making sure that it's sustainable long term. And that, of course, required economic resources, but also a way to survive the international backlash, right? The countermeasures that Ukraine would have inevitably encountered if it made a different decision regarding this nuclear issue.
I was wondering, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the question became, to whom do all the armaments in the non-Russian republics belong to? And, apart from Russia and Ukraine, did the USSR have nuclear bombs stationed in other republics? And also, how were conventional arms divided among the republics?
So these are all very good questions. In terms of nuclear weapons, in addition to Russia and Ukraine, Kazakhstan and Belarus were also two other republics that inherited considerable shards of this Soviet nuclear arsenal. And they too conducted their own negotiations, although amongst the three non-Russian successor states, Ukraine was the most proactive. And certainly both Belarus and Kazakhstan benefited considerably from the results of Ukrainian negotiations, because by extension, they also got the same kind of Budapest memorandums and also compensation for the fissile material in nuclear material contained in the warheads and other things. Now, it's interesting you ask about conventional armaments, because, of course, the issue of the division of conventional military assets was not at all as controversial and did not become subject of international politics in the same way as nuclear inheritance of the Soviet Union. I mean, Ukraine inherited an enormous amount of conventional armaments. That seems rather ironic now when Ukraine is struggling to supply front lines with armaments. But at the time of Soviet dissolution, Ukraine had about 1 million men under arms. and huge amounts of conventional armaments. A lot of it was withdrawn from the Warsaw Pact that had collapsed right early on, and some of these troops and armaments were being withdrawn from Eastern Europe and bivouacked in Ukraine, but also in Belarus at the time. And so the issue of the division of conventional assets became more a matter of negotiations between the successor republics themselves. Was not a matter of international politics in the same way. But because nuclear part of this military inheritance essentially fell under different set of rules, because there was this large international non-proliferation regime, the so-called Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons that existed at the time, that basically managed and regulated and provided guidance for nuclear possession in the world. Then the issue of nuclear weapons became a matter of international interest, international politics, international contention. And of course, because it has been a long-standing interest, say, of the United States to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So it became an issue for U.S. policy as well.
Also, I remember back then in the 90s, there was a program called the Megatons to Megawatts program, where the United States bought, down-blended uranium from Russia for its own nuclear power plants. How exactly did this function in practice, and what happened to the fissile material that was based in Ukraine initially?
So Ukraine became basically a beneficiary of this program as well. And there was a calculation that took place that basically assessed the amount of fissile material, both plutonium and highly enriched uranium, extracted from the warheads, both strategic and tactical nuclear weapons that were withdrawn from Ukraine. And in exchange, Ukraine received fuel, down-blended uranium, low-enriched uranium, in the fuel assemblies for Ukrainian power plants. So for quite a few years afterwards, Ukrainian nuclear power plants, which account for about 50% of electricity generation in Ukraine, ran on that fuel. Now, all of this was underwritten by Megatons to Megawatts program. So the United States essentially paid for this conversion. And the program itself was conceived primarily for Russia to basically, assist it with the process of disarmament, to remove any impediments that Russian government might have to say, well, listen, we can't disarm so quickly under these treaties, arms control treaties, specifically the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, the first one signed in 1991, simply because we don't have a way to dispose or the way to do what to do with the nuclear material, with tons and tons of nuclear material that's released from the process. So it was a brilliant, actually, MIT scientist, Tim F. He recently actually passed away, who conceived of this idea back in October 1991 and convinced the US government to go ahead. And it is true that also, inadvertently, this low enriched uranium from Russia also powered nuclear power plants in the United States. And it's the reason why we see today that Russia does have still a significant share in international uranium markets, international enrichment markets, right? And that's why it is so hard for us now to think of what to do with Russian nuclear supplies and how to sanction them. Following the Russian occupation of Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the biggest one in Europe, right?
In one of your earlier interviews, you discussed 3 scenarios where, how Russia could use nuclear weapons. Could you share them with our viewers, please?
So I don't know if you've seen my latest piece for the bulletin, I've advanced recently a rather controversial scenario for how Russia might use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Contra popular or received wisdom, I have argued that it's actually not when Russia's in retreat, when Russia faces imminent defeat, that it might resort to a nuclear use, although that danger still exists, but actually when Russia is winning in Ukraine. And the reason why is that even though we know in October, in the fall of 2022, there was a heightened fear based on US intelligence reports that the Russian leadership actually considered using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine in response to Ukraine's successful counteroffensive. And that, in that case, several things worked to dissuade Russia, right? We still have very limited information, so we must keep that in mind, right? But several things worked to dissuade Russia from resorting to nuclear use. And one was the position of the United States, who said, you know, this would be a game changer, and likely the United States would respond with conventional means to such a Russian attack against Russian military targets on Ukrainian sovereign territory, on the occupied territory, right? And also the involvement and messages from Chinese and Indian leadership, right? So some combination of these things, and possibly the lack of military utility on the battlefield for nuclear weapons, right? That would affect the theater in very close quarters for both Russian and Ukrainian troops, and would make the conventional operations very complicated, right? So some combination of these factors serve to dissuade Russia from using nuclear weapons. Now, if we think of, say, of a different scenario, when Ukrainian lines collapse, Ukrainian defense lines collapse, and the Russian troops are really making very rapid progress. They have been making quite a bit of progress over 2024 already. But let's say the last line of Ukrainian defenses collapse. And, you know, Kyiv is in sight, if not in hand, for the Russian forces. So the prize is the entire Ukraine, not just another sliver of territory. But they know that Ukrainians will put up resistance, that this will be bloody, this will be still costly, but possible. Now, I fear that in such a situation, Russia would have an incentive to use a nuclear weapon, say, over a secondary Ukrainian city like Mykolaiv or Kryvyi Rih or Vinnytsia, and say, you know, Kyiv will be next in 3 days if Ukraine does not surrender unconditionally. And then the price would be this unconditional surrender. Now, when Ukraine is a lost cause, I don't think the United States and NATO would actually deliver on their threat of conventional retaliation against a Russian nuclear use. At least that possibility would be lower. And I think the Russians would know it. And, you know, the Chinese opprobrium would not be as essential for Russia that is winning its war in Europe. And the political consequences, the impression that use would make on NATO capitals, you know, once Russia occupied Ukraine, would also be significant and allow Russia to dictate its terms of the pan-European security settlement following this war. So I think the set of incentives to use a nuclear weapon when Russia is actually significantly winning in Ukraine is greater than when Russia is losing. But then, of course, you know, I think one thing, Haroon, that we're realizing in this war, that all of us, even experts and certainly decision makers, know very little about the dynamics of nuclear escalation. We haven't been here before. We can only guess, right?
It's completely uncharted territory.
Indeed.
Right. And finally, you know, there are certain realists such as Stephen Walt who argue that, you know, the U.S. should stop arming Ukraine because of the what's in it for us moment. How do you respond to such criticism? And do you see such thinking as, you know, resonating more now within the Capitol, the Hill, and the White House?
Yes, well, someone like Stephen Walt presents his arguments against arming Ukraine and U.S. involvement in support of Ukraine, not just on what's in it for us reasons. He actually tried to advance a moral argument saying that the more armaments for Ukraine, the longer the war continues, the more people dead. And so it's actually immoral. Right. And I have published a rebuttal, so I've argued powerfully against that.
Just to interrupt you very briefly, that was exactly the same argument used by some American politicians and academics during the genocide of Bosnian Muslims in the 1990s, who argued for not arming the Bosnian army.
Well, yeah, so what we know about the just war theory and the way it developed from the Christian, from early Christian communities who were, very deeply pacifist, right? They were willing to sacrifice themselves, to martyr themselves, so not to use violence, right, in response. Where that broke down is not actually, we think today that the right for self-defense being sort of the paramount cause for just war, which is true. But where that broke down in the beginning in the early Christian communities was what are the ethical and moral implications for seeing a weaker party, a woman and a child being killed, and you do nothing because you're pacifist and you're nonviolent. It's not about yourself. You can choose to martyr yourself, but do you not provide assistance and defense for the weaker party, right? So in that sense, that pacifist argument breaks down and the morality of pacifism breaks down. So you have to be able to provide defenses for civilians and for the weaker party that's unable to defend themselves. Right. And but in terms of more pragmatic matters, which is what politics normally is, my rebuttal to this realist argument, such as Waltzian arguments about what's in it for us, or whether it's even has any moral implications, is it's short-term versus long-term consequences. Short-term, maybe yes, just give up on Ukraine, have it being occupied, or have it bleed indefinitely on the periphery of Europe, or as you mentioned, Bosnia, who even could put it on the map back at the time, right? People didn't know where it was. But long term, there might not be justice in this world, but there sure as hell are consequences.
Right.
So you always have the will. You let a country like Ukraine descend into a mess at the hands of the Russians, there will be refugee flows, there will be, shadow economy, there will be constant perpetuating wound on the margin, in the middle of Europe, actually. It's not the margins of Europe. The Balkans, just like Ukraine, are the heart in the middle of Europe. And so what does it do for your European project? What does it do for the structure of economic and political cooperation and human rights? What does leaving crimes against humanity and genocides going unpunished, what does that do for the never again we said, in 1945? We just commemorated 80 years of the Holocaust Remembrance Day when the whole world was horrified and we said never again. And now we had another genocide. We had Srebrenica. We had, now we have Bucha and Izum and other places.
Right.
So, that kind of raises a bigger set of questions that, and that will come back to bite us down the road.
Right. Mariana, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?